Gray Man is definitely one of my favorite stories so far. I hope you guys enjoyed as much as I did. The Haunted Mansion offered only two types of summer employment: ghost or tour guide. A ghost's job was to scare people, and when there wasn't anyone to scare, they hung out on the front porch of the mansion. Smartphones hadn't been invented yet, so they passed the time by talking, smoking, and making out in the coffins. A tour guide's job was to pick up trash, collect tickets, and deal with herds of sweaty, tired guests. They weren't allowed on the front porch. Now, the Haunted Mansion wasn't some ordinary, run-of-the-mill spook house made of cheap plywood and jump scares. It was a masterpiece. It had started out as a real house, a beautiful Victorian, but a fire had gutted the inside, killing one person and rendering the home uninhabitable. A master carpenter, noticing its potential, had bought it cheap, moved it to the amusement park, and begun its transformation. First, he blocked the windows to keep out the light. Then he sealed out the front and back doors, and built a new guest entrance on the side of the building. Then he added flickering chandeliers covered in cobwebs, paintings that seemed to come alive, and stairs that creaked all the way up to a landing that tilted when stepped on, as though it was going to crash to the floor below. Most ingenious of all was the web of secret passages hidden behind the walls, accessible only by a series of invisible doors. These passages allowed ghosts to seemingly appear out of nowhere, vanish, and then silently materialize in an entirely different part of the house. The effect was terrifying. The secret hallways were painted black and kept completely dark. So in order to sprint through them noiselessly, ghosts had to memorize the entire labyrinth and locations of the concealed doors. Every summer, they suffered bruises and bloody noses from running into walls, but it was worth it. Danny would have given anything to be a ghost. He knew the passages better than anyone. He had great haunting skills and an epic Jack the Ripper costume. Every year, he practiced for the auditions, and every year, he got rejected. He couldn't understand it. "You're like a flashlight in a drunk drawer," his mom would say. "You can shine all day, but it doesn't matter if no one sees." So Danny settled for being a tour guide. Wearing a monocle and a false mustache, he guided visitors into the ghostly library to begin their tour. "Welcome to the Haunted Mansion," he'd say in his best Transylvanian accent, "where all your nightmares will come true. Vlad, the original owner of this mansion, tortured his victims by impaling them on stakes in this very backyard, and their screams rang throughout the countryside. The villagers finally lynched him, but Vlad returned from the dead and brought back the worst residents of hell. They still roam this place, looking for fresh blood and new victims." Danny loathed that stupid story. He found it particularly insulting in light of the fact that the mansion had an actual, honest-to-God ghost about whom he would have happily made up countless stories. But employees weren't allowed to talk about Gray Man, especially not with customers. According to legend, Gray Man was huge, and he always held something in his hand: a shotgun, a cane, a cleaver. Nobody knew for sure. He appeared in a drifting gray mist, sometimes standing against the wall, facing towards it, hands at his side, like a child put in a corner. Mostly, though, he crawled. Seeing him approach on his hands and knees, scuttling across the floor, was a very unsettling experience. It was easy to tell when guests inadvertently encountered him. They'd stumbled out of the mansion, pale and shaken, heading straight to the manager to complain. "The employee in the gray costume is too scary," Danny had once heard a guest say. "I thought you had a no-touching rule. You need to talk to that guy, or someone's gonna get hurt." Managers always apologized and refunded their money. They never told guests the truth, though, that they've encountered an authentic ghost. The haunted mansion was supposed to be scary in an entertaining way. Gray Man was the kind of scary that wasn't fun at all. Danny worked long shifts, and during lulls in guest traffic, he'd sneak around the side of the house and stand in a flower bed near the porch. Hidden in the shadows, he'd savor the ghost's voice and cigarette smoke drifting on the summer air. Everyone had a Gray Man story, each one scarier than the one before. Danny loved them all. He had so many questions. Why did the Gray Man crawl? What did he carry? Why did he stare at the walls? One night, while eavesdropping, Danny thought he heard his own name, followed by a commotion of whispers and shuffling. "Seriously, he's like right over there," someone said softly. Danny stayed still, like a ninja. He closed his eyes and clenched his fist, trying to make himself smaller. Then Amber, a zombie bride, spoke loudly. "So they tried to schedule me for third shift tomorrow night, but I'm not doing it. I don't care what they say." "Well, I'm not doing it either. I doubt anyone will," added Megan, an inbred, psycho hillbilly, who sat cross-legged on one of the coffins. "I wish we knew someone who would." Danny could not believe his ears. They needed a ghost. Of course it was their shift, the last shift of the night, the one nobody wanted. Customers were scarce at that time, and they were mostly drunk and belligerent. Also, Gray Man had a tendency to appear during those hours. Danny didn't care. He'd do anything to be a ghost. "Hey dork, you spying on us?" asked Trip, a newly dead football player with the gory gashes on his face. The guy had been a ghost for the past 3 summers, and a dick for probably his whole life. Danny took a deep breath, ripped off his mustache, and forced himself to step into view. "Hey guys," he said. "Danny, what are you doing here?" asked Amber, putting a cigarette between her lips. "I can cover third shift if you want, or whatever," Danny said. "You do third shift?" asked Megan. "Aren't you scared?" She narrowed her eyes. He shook his head. "What about Gray Man?" He shrugged. "Come on, Megs, he can handle it. Can't you, Danny boy?" said Trip. Danny nodded. "Okay, I'll set it up," said Megan. "Meet us here tomorrow night, and we'll get you started, okay?" "Deal," said Danny, too eagerly, dorkly, embarrassingly. "And dude, get a decent costume, like a scary one. Nobody likes that stupid Shakespeare crap," added Trip, too excited to educate him on the difference between Elizabethan poems and Victorian serial killers. Danny took off around the side of the haunted mansion. He showed up early the next night. The ghost partied every night, But this time it looked like they brought the party to the mansion. They lounged on the coffins, laughing and drinking beer. Everyone seemed to be there except Tripp. Danny was too happy to bother wondering why. "I can't believe you're doing third shift," said Amber. "You're brave." Some kid snickered, but Danny looked at his shoes and shuffled them in the dirt. He didn't like to brag, but he was pretty brave. His mom always said so. "Hey, go on to the costume room and put up your makeup," said Megan. "For real?" "Yeah, you're one of us now, right?" Danny had seen the costume room before, of course, but he never used it. Cramped and brightly lit, it smelled of stage makeup, which reminded him of rotten carrots, but in a wonderful way that filled him with excitement. He'd worn his Jack the Ripper costume in spite of Tripp's protest, and he was glad. Anything else wouldn't have felt right. He added a splash of blood on his glasses, then went to the porch to wait with the other ghost. Just as he sat down, the alert came that customers were approaching. After entering the mansion through the employee entrance, he slipped into one of the secret hallways. He paused, wishing his eyes would adjust to the darkness. A few dim red guide lights glowed near the floor, but they didn't provide any light to see by. Arms outstretched, Danny walked gingerly towards the front of the mansion, where he'd make his first appearance to the guests as they left the haunted library. He stopped where he thought the door was located, reached for the handle, and found it exactly where he'd expected. He smiled in the darkness. He was born for this. Danny took a minute to get into character, then opened the door to the mansion proper. The guest should have been walking right past by then, up the ramp from the library. But nobody was there. A thin layer of gray vapor floated near the ceiling, which was odd because the fog machine had been broken since the beginning of summer. Then he smelled cigarettes. Then he frowned. Everyone knew smoking in the mansion was a fire hazard. Hurrying to the library, Danny found it empty too. He felt a pang of fear. Had he missed an entire group of guests? He re-entered the secret passages and hurried to the next exit, which was concealed in a grandfather clock in the dining room. Nobody was there either. Sweating now, Danny listened in vain for the creaking stairs or the landing pretend fallen. He'd lost the guest. It was such a rookie mistake, so humiliating. Back inside the passages, he bounded up the concealed stairway, 2 steps at a time, ran down a hall, and emerged from behind a painting of a gruesome old man holding a skull. If the guests were upstairs, he would hear them. He heard nothing. Danny barreled back downstairs, and when he came to the ramp again, his heart ceased. It was filled with smoke. Nauseated, Danny watched the gray haze swirl and dance as something moved through it, fast. He screamed as Gray Man burst out of the smoke and pounded towards him. Danny couldn't move, not even to step out of the way as Gray Man closed the distance between him. Everything felt like slow motion, like a dream where you can't speak or move. Squinting, Danny saw that the specter was holding something. A video camera. It wasn't Gray Man, he realized. It was Tripp, dressed in gray clothes. "Out of the way, freak. There's a fire back there. We need to get out of here and call the fire department." He hit Danny with his shoulder as he ran past, shoving him into the wall. What about the gas? No gas, just you and me, he yelled before disappearing into the darkness at the back of the mansion. Danny didn't follow, physically or mentally. Why would Tripp dress up like Gray Man? Nobody ever did that. They were too scared of pissing up the real ghost. Was this an initiation ritual? Is that why they've been videotaping? One thing Danny knew for sure. He wasn't letting the haunted mansion burn down. Not on his watch. He hurried to where the smoke seemed the densest, holding his cape over his face, breathing through the thin material. The fire was in the area filled with smoke. Even the red guidelights were now concealed. He searched for the fire, coughing and choking and cursing Tripp. The idiot had been smoking in the mansion, probably drinking too, and then he felt sure that that was how the fire had started. He tripped over something, fell, and when he stood up, he was disoriented. There was no air, only smoke, and he couldn't see where he'd come in. He ran his hands over the walls, fingers scrabbling over every crack and indentation, hoping to find a door by blind luck. He tried the other side, but felt nothing except the rough black paint that covered the walls. Remembering some grade school fire safety video, Danny dropped to his knees where the smoke was thinner. The air was clear enough to see, and there, at the other end of the hallway, was Gray Man, glowing slightly. He crouched on his hands and knees, motionless and alert, like he was searching for something. His face looked blurry through the smoke, but there was no mistaking the moment he saw Danny, because he began crawling instantaneously. Danny scooted back, slamming his head into the wall. Blood dripped down the back of his neck. Tears coursed over his face. Desperately, he reached behind him, feeling blindly for the outline of the door. As Gray Man crawled closer, Danny saw what he held in his hand. An adze. He tried to scream, but couldn't muster the air, so he watched silently as Gray Man pushed the adze along the floor each time his hand moved forward. Crying harder now, Danny tried again, and finally found the outline of the door. But the handle wasn't there. The surface was smooth under his fingers. He ran them around the edge of the door again. Where was the handle? Gray Man had stopped on his hands and knees in front of Danny and was moving his head in an unnatural way, like a drugged animal about to attack. Smoke swirled around both of them, obscuring everything. But Danny could see Gray Man gesturing with his adze, pointing towards the door he leaned against. Suddenly, Danny knew the answers to all his questions. Gray Man crawled, because he'd been trained to keep his body low under layers of smoke, to stay safe in burning buildings. He seemed so massive because his heavy coat and helmet, and the adze in his hand, was a Pulaski. Gray Man was a fireman. He was the one who died in the first fire, before the house became the haunted mansion. When Danny pictured the original floor plan, it made even more sense. Gray Man stared at the walls, because that's where the windows had been, and the spot Danny leaned against had once been the front door of the house. It had been sealed shut by the carpenter, but Gray Man didn't know that. It was the only exit he knew, the only door he'd seen before he died. Gray Man moved even faster now, and Danny closed his eyes just before he felt his body smash against the closed door. His nose broke, and blood poured down his shirt. He screamed, but it made no difference to Gray Man. He was a fireman, and his job was to get Danny through that door, out of the house, no matter how difficult it was, no matter how long it took, to save him.